Willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 58 of my game system design series of videos. In this video, I will discuss an attempt to find a quick and easy method to create a repeatable scenario for games, figure games, specifically World War II, Cold Wars and modern, but also applicable to musket and pike. The objective of the video is really designed for those who wish to create ad hoc scenarios. While historical scenarios are mentioned, their creation is outside the scope of this video. I have a series of videos covering various battles for those interested in historical scenarios, and thus I will mainly focus on ad hoc scenarios. When creating a scenario, you have two options. The first is to recreate a historical conflict, and the second is to create a scenario framework which can be used by any force mix, but which is regulated by some form of point system. I call this second option an ad hoc scenario. While this video's primary focus is micro-armor or World War II, Cold War and modern conflicts, the basic building blocks apply to other periods, especially musket and pike. While less applicable to ancients, players who wish to refight the pre-battle maneuvering could also find this methodology useful for the ancient periods. I originally created this video as a two-part set. This updated version contains both parts together. In my original video, I only covered what I call fixed ad hoc scenarios. These are common in the ancient world: two armies, equal points values, standard deployment, and then battle it out on a playing area. Using this system for musket and pike, World War II, Cold War and moderns often results in a boring game. The initial answer was to expand the number of different standard scenarios, which is what this video covers. For musket and pike, World War II, Cold War, moderns, historical scenarios have been the most common successful type of scenarios for many years for a variety of reasons. The first is it's the quickest and easiest method of creating a scenario with unbalanced force mixes. The downside is to make the victory conditions mean anything, it requires a lot of play testing. The final issue or downside is finding a historical conflict to game. While rules which allow you to command a division have a large number of well-researched historical candidates, when all you can command is a battalion, the range does drop dramatically. You also have an issue with reality. When the game turn length is 15 minutes, it can be difficult to find a historical conflict which spans the typical time you could play in a single day. The result is you have to adopt a more abstract interpretation of history. The points-based scenario method, by its very nature, starts at a much more abstract point. The designer creates a simple scenario with force mixes and reinforcement schedules based on points. The advantages is players can create many different games with no playtesting required. In theory, it can allow players to have a quick ad hoc game which is balanced. This was certainly the most common system used in the past, but normally resulted in even matched meeting engagements, which ended up being anything but interesting. This also encouraged players to become points lawyers, carefully studying the element types and coming up with the optimal force mix based on points benefits. Finally, the main benefit is to allow for quick ad hoc games, but in order to optimize the points, players often spent a lot of time and effort building their force mix, which defeated the whole point of being an easy-to-play scenario. The best solution was to merge the best aspect of historical and also points-based systems, with a large focus on historical accuracy and using points only as a general guide rather than a deterministic guide. This is the approach which tends to work the best. However, it requires an enormous amount of work getting the force mixes correct up front. In a pure historical scenario, we know the formations and equipment, with the only vague area being the exact number of tanks or men, as casualties and breakdowns would have messed up the nice and neat formation organizations. Using this merged framework system, we need to have a very good knowledge of the actual historical organization of the parent formation, from which we select forces as if we were an actual commander. To avoid gaming the point system, you need very extensive and complete scenario guides, which force players to select elements in a historically accurate method. The optimum method is to provide a force mix in the same way as if you were creating a historical scenario, with only reasonable and historical options allowed. This also has the benefit of duplicating one of the main benefits of historical scenarios. You know almost exactly what you'll be fielding. This makes game setup much quicker. One method which we could leverage is the traditional army list system. This is reasonably easy to create from an official THEORIE, but does require a lot of effort to create your own force mix when you actually build it out. This system requires each player to pre-create their force mixes before they turn up for a game. It is possible to design these types of army lists in a manner which allow for quicker force mix creation. In this example, we are given the entire division and each player selects the formations which make sense. Thus, if the points total was 2,000 points, we are dealing with, let's say, one infantry regiment, or 1,346 points, and supporting formations to make up the remaining 654 points. This restricts what each player can field, as in this case the player must field an entire infantry regiment, only allowing for a small custom selection process. You only need to worry about calculating the 654 points, not the entire 2,000 points. Other systems provide each player with building blocks, which they assemble. In this case, each building block is a division. However, depending on the rules, it could be a regiment, battalion, or even company. Each player selects the building blocks up to the required points total. In this example, the building blocks are printed on cards. However, a simple list of building blocks would also be viable, which players can select from. This shows the building block approach presented in the form of a list, which I got from DBN, strangely enough. The benefit here is a player can more quickly create a force mix, allowing players to create their force mix on the day before the game. Basically, the definition of an ad hoc game. It is true that asking players to pre-create their force mix before the game does have many benefits. The main benefit is the player can pack their exact force mix in boxes before heading out to play. The setup time is short. This is an advantage historical scenarios also possess. A card-based system is normally designed for players to randomly select cards before the game, which results in a unique and different game. There is no reason why players could not conduct their card selection process the day before the game, slowly building up their forces in the manner they wish. The rules associated with this would need to be carefully structured, with the opposing player allowed to verify the selection at the end of the game. If the points value was higher or lower, then the VPs would be adjusted accordingly. Now we come to the actual scenario. My initial system was to use a very simple scenario with only the force mixes being different. All my force mixes use a very simple scenario framework, which is a 2-to-1 attacker advantage in the first half and the defender getting a force equal in size to the attacker in the second half of the game. It took a lot of play testing to get to this point, and it does give me a reasonable game and allows players to determine who has won or lost a game, assuming, of course, the number of elements that you're commanding is not excessive. The objective in this scenario was to get a lot of movement and to force players to attack in order to have any hope of victory. In that, it succeeded, and any attacking player which delays or displays unusual caution will almost certainly lose this kind of scenario. As a result, the most experienced players always need to be the attacker, which does allow the less experienced players to learn the rope without seriously compromising his or her chance of victory. Of course, when it's the defender's chance to attack, the lack of experience will normally prove fatal. You may ask how I achieve this and how historically accurate this scenario possibly is. Well, as it's an ad hoc scenario, historical accuracy is not that particularly important, but the 2-to-1 ratio in order to attack is generally a reasonable, historically accurate statement. In terms of movement, forcing movement can only be achieved by victory conditions, at least that's what I discovered. The first lesson I learned is any victory points based on casualties, for example, encouraged caution and reduce any kind of movement. So casualties must have no effect or minimal effect on the victory conditions. The next lesson I learned was victory conditions based on a specific objective on the playing area was prone to a lot of gamey behaviour by players. It was common in my WRG Cold War games, micro armor games, to send some poor wheeled reconnaissance element at its maximum speed to take a village or objective on the last game turn. Thus, that type of victory determination had to be quickly abandoned. In the end, the most robust system was to determine control of a playing area row for the attacker only, both the first time a row was considered as under control and at the end of the game. It's possible this could be extended to consider control of a tile rather than the whole row, but this requires additional rules and proved unnecessary. Thus I adopted the row approach. Incidentally, after I created this video, I abandoned the row approach and went back to the objective approach, and that seems to work based on the rules that you use. But swinging back to the row methodology, an example on the right is a playing area which is made up of 12 tiles, each of which can be any size but is typically a 30 centimetre square or a 60 centimetre square if using imperial measures, 1 foot square or 2 foot square. Each row consists of 3 tiles. If playing across the short axis of the playing area, control may descend down to individual squares. Control is based on having more in-supply elements in a row than your opponent, and having all rows to your rear under control. Some elements should not count, such as headquarters, non-combat elements, and some indirect fire elements, such as artillery. The latter was to avoid players throwing their divisional level indirect fire elements into the front line. This can be adjusted before each game with common agreement. If a set of rules did not use the concept of supply, just add it for victory purposes only. I do this for LWRS, and it does work for victory conditions purposes. The rules can be used for this rule can be used for any set of rules and is probably less a supply rule than a victory condition rule in this particular case. As I indicated earlier, you can achieve the same objective by the use of objectives, which tends to be a much simpler process. After much experimentation, I discovered this was an easier method than worrying about control of 1 foot squares. In this case, we have 3 objectives. This structure can be used if play across the long or short axis. Going back to the original question I asked quite a while ago is how historically accurate these scenarios are. That's more difficult to answer and can be influenced by the rules. My original answer was to use a document printed back in July 1988 called Historical Characteristics of Combat for Wargamers, prepared by Robert McQuay for the US military. This is a good document, and I encourage anyone interested in the topic to download it from the internet, but it did have a number of issues for my purpose. I then discovered, by accident, another US Army document called FM105-5, Maneuver Control, printed in December 1967, and which gave me the tools I needed to determine if my scenario framework was historically accurate in terms of typical result. This document provided me with a number of charts which allowed me to determine advance rates based on firepower, terrain, and preparedness. I covered this in more detail in a previous video if you're interested. This shows a playing area using a ground scale of 1 in 10,000, with each square representing a tile of 30 centimetres square. I have gamed this using 3 different sets of rules, and in this case we're looking at World War II. If it was modern, the final advance would be mounted, and it would be probably quicker. This takes 6.5 hours to break through the defender's prepared line, which represents 3 game turns for LWRS and 6 games for Corps Commander version 6. In my games, the breakthrough only occurred on one flank, and there were many more hours of rolling up that flank and driving forward to prepare a defence line against the enemy counterattack. Incidentally, when I talk about hours, I'm talking about real hours, not gaming hours. LWRS uses a game turn scale of 2 hours per game turn, with the counterattack occurring during the second day. Using LWRS, it normally took 4 game turns to break through, leaving me with 2 game turns to take control of all the rows and prepare a defence line, and roll up most of the defender's initial front line. All my scenarios are based on a game of 12 daylight game turns, with the defender's reinforcements arriving on game turn 7. In LWRS, this represents 2 days, as little ever occurred at night. There were defenders left behind, which I needed to deal with in the second day. This is slower than indicated by the FM105-5 manual, but probably within the margin of error of that particular manual, so at least with LWRS, the scenario does reflect something which resembles reality. Corps Commander version 6 uses a game turn scale of 1 hour per game turn, with the enemy counterattack arriving on game turn 7. It also normally took 4 game turns to break through, leaving me with 2 game turns to take control of all the rows and prepare a defence line and roll up most of the defender's initial front line. There were, once again, defenders left behind, which I had to deal with in the afternoon, but as a Corps Commander uses supply, they were a minimal threat. This is much faster than indicated by the FM105-5 manual and probably is a bit outside the margin of error, which makes me think the game turn scale for these rules should probably really be 90 minutes or 120 minutes instead of 60 minutes. While not an extensive test, I did try a single game of Corps Commander: The Road to Berlin, which is basically the set of rules which Corps Commander version 6 was based on. This used the game turn scale of 30 minutes to see what would occur. Corps Commander uses a ground scale of 1 in 5,000, so I needed a larger playing area. It took physically longer to break through, and I took much higher casualties, but I broke through too quickly in terms of game turns. I suspect if I had another game, I would take my time to reduce losses, but my test was inconclusive, and this may have been a fluke. My personal feeling is these rules were designed for a game turn scale of 60 minutes rather than 30 minutes, which is the scale used in the parent Corps Commander rules, which was the Cold War version of these rules. If this was the case, then these particular rules were probably much more accurate. For those not familiar with Corps Commander rules, the World War II version changed the ground scale from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 5,000, so weapon ranges would be similar between the periods. However, to keep the movement rates similar, the designer changed the game turn scale from 60 minutes to 30 minutes, which I suspect was probably an error. LWRS does something similar with ground scale, but the game turn scale was not changed, so would not have the same issues as Corps Commander. I have conducted some preliminary testing with Spearhead, but I never arrived at any form of conclusion. Based on my incomplete games, the rated advance seems reasonable, but the game turn scale and the ground scale would restrict any game to only a part of the breakthrough. Perhaps the start point would be a position 1,000 metres from the defence line, and the game would only cover only part of the breakthrough. I need to conduct more play testing before I come to a final conclusion, but one lesson learned is the rule scales have a major effect, which makes me think these rules need a very different type of scenario, one which does not include any form of breakthrough, but instead focuses on incremental advances, or just covers part of a breakthrough. In conclusion, for the rules I tested, the results seem reasonable. The major issue was the rules game turn scale. The optimal length of any game is 12 game turns. 8 is probably better, but 12 is a reasonable length for a game which can be completed within a day. As a result, irrespective of the game turn scale, reinforcements always arrive on game turn 7. As long as the movement rate is large enough and the close combat or fire combat system gives you a quick enough result, then the scenario framework which I've described so far should work with any set of rules. Now we come to the downside. The scenario works and works reasonably well. However, after playing it over and over again, the game generally always results in similar tactics being used and a similar result based on those tactics. You may need to get a few games to get to this point, but eventually you play out this scenario. Changing the force mix ratios, or even just changing the force mixes, could give it more legs, but if you're attacking as the Germans in September 39 or December 44, the general tactics remain the same. A fixed ad hoc scenario system did not work for World War II, Cold War or moderns. In the end, I needed to create new scenarios so players have a wider range of scenarios to select. Saying all that, if you look at this particular scenario I've described so far, you should be able to get about half a dozen games out of it before you basically play it out. The first scenario I constructed uses a 2-to-1 odds attacker, defender. The ratios I'm using is based on points, which is in turn dependent on specific rules. In order to validate this with reality, I'm using the firepower ratio described in FM 105-5 manual, that's the US manual, thus I'm assuming points is equivalent to firepower. One point I wish to clarify is the term firepower, or what firepower means in the FM 105-5 manual. There is an extensive description of how to calculate this in the manual, but in my scenario I'm simply using points to replace it. This may not be correct and may result in some unusual results, which has required me to put in a lot of work in calculating points values. For LWRS, I was required to create a totally different point system to the original rules in order to make it work. The same may apply to other rules, but for now I'm using points instead of firepower for the odds ratio for those who wish to compare these charts to the actual initial manual. Drilling down into the original US manual, in the FM 105-5 manual, attacking odds of 1 to 1 is stated as possible, which initially had me confused as I could see no values for this. The manual indicated you need 2 to 1 odds to advance at all, but once over the assault line you still need at least 1 to 1 odds to continue your advance. This means you must start at 2 to 1, and once factoring losses you need 1 to 1 at least to keep the advance going. My assumption is once the odds drop below 1 to 1 everything stops, but until then you're using the original 2 to 1 ratio in the tables when you calculate advance. Once I worked this rather niggling thing out, I was disappointed as I was hoping for some values of odds less than 2 to 1 in order to make an advance possible. It should also be noted in the manual it states that a 1 to 1 odds attack against defenders in the open is counted as a 2 to 1 attack. This is a possible scenario with the defender holding the playing area and being attacked by an equal size force. However, I remembered that once the actual odds drop to less than 1 to 1, the advance immediately stops, so it wouldn't be a particularly long game. As a result, I feel this is not a viable scenario, and from a common sense point, probably makes no sense at all. That is a 1 to 1 or a meeting engagement. A scenario which involves catching the enemy in the open and unprepared may not also be particularly interesting or common or even of any interest to individual players to refight. As I've concluded in many other videos in the past, the conclusion from this little analysis is that you should not play a game which involves equal forces. Strangely enough, the FM 105-5 manual aligns with my conclusion, as these type of games, with both sides staring at each other from held down positions, results in neither side ever moving, or if one did, it would get slaughtered. My next thought's that a scenario based on odds of 1.5 to 1 could give me a game which could be played on a smaller playing area. However, no values are provided in the US manual. This is when I decided to do some gut feel calculation, assumed the rate of advance would be half of a 2 to 1 odds game. In this case, I have a possible scenario which would not involve any counterattack and would span an entire game. So we get a second scenario that we can use. Incidentally, I did originally try this force mix ratio, that's 1.5 to 1 in my early playtesting, but I abandoned it because it never gave the defenders a chance to counterattack. But if that does not bother you, then this is certainly an option that you could consider. The other point is movement is low, so at 1 in 1/10,000 ground scale, the attacker would cover 40 centimetres in 6 game turns of play, and another 20 centimetres in the following 6 game turns, with almost all the combat occurring in the second tile, in this example you see here. You would need to play along the short axis of the playing area, which does give you some interesting flank attack options. You can see by this image we don't get really much movement for our 12 game turns of play, and the victory conditions would need to use control of a tile as 1 victory point, determined at the end of the game only. 4 victory points or less is an attacker loss, more than 8 victory points is an attacker win, and the rest some form of draw. My only concern is victory points calculation based on a single tile is prone to gamey tactics, so a great deal of thought is required to avoid this. I'd be tempted to include reinforcements, but reinforcements would need to retain the 1.5 to 1 ratio and occur for both players, so in retrospect it would be best not to include any, for this particular scenario at least. Because in this case the defender never needs to take territory, the defender's force mix would be focused on defensive elements such as infantry anti-tank guns and a small mobile counter-attack force. This would be an infantry division for World War II and some attached assets from corps level. It must be noted the defender would have prepared their defences, so would have deployed for defence and in cover, but would be not fortified or dug in. As it's infantry, the bulk of the forces would not really be mobile. Not quite sure if this would be particularly exciting for the defender, but that's basically the conclusion if you go down this particular path. Element density would need to be low and should be about 50 elements for the defender, which means the front line will not be heavily defended, but as infantry is cheap, the defender would have sufficient elements to cover the front, perhaps 12 elements in each centre tile and 8 elements in each flank tile, assuming 4 elements for air and artillery support, leaving you with no more than 6 elements to act as reserve. On the other hand, the attacker would need high-value elements, which would probably consist of about 50 elements as well. Air and artillery support would consist of about 8 elements, leaving you with 42 elements. Placing 6 elements in 3 tiles gives you an attack force of 24 elements, which should give you a local superiority of 3 to 1, if attacking one of the centre tiles. In this case, that would be wise, as the flank tiles lack any roads for supply, which may not be an issue for rules such as LWRS, but for rules such as Corps Commander version 6 it would be definitely an issue. As a result, a 1.5 to 1 odds scenario would offer an interesting game, using the short axes of a playing area and giving you a result in 12 game turns. In our example, I've used a set of rules which use a ground scale of 1 in 10,000. If we move to Spearhead or FFT3, this may work as well, but it's unlikely to work with squad scale sets of rules. The result is the defenders could deploy forces on the front line which cover most of the front line with basically machine gun fire, etc. Thus, no local superiority is possible unless you use a much, much larger playing area. A larger playing area requires more elements, resulting in a longer game or reduced number of game turns. In this example, we can see the range of a heavy machine gun at a scale of 1 in 2,000. Unless terrain gets in the way, the defender can bring its entire firepower on a single point on the front line, which means there is no point having reserves. The attacker can do so as well, but they can never achieve any form of local superiority. Strangely enough, the older WRG rules for World War II uses a ground scale of 1 in 4,000, so using those rules, this may be viable, as the defender can only cover half the playing area with a single element. Thus, as a result, the attackers could achieve a local superiority on one of the flanks. When we move to higher odds, such as 3 to 1 or greater, this could also work, but would offer little benefit compared with 2 to 1 odds game, and require more reinforcements to balance the game out. I experimented with 3 to 1 odds and found it a painful experience for the defender, at least the first half. Playing a set of rules which has a sufficiently large scale can allow you to achieve these odds in a single tile, so it's not as if you could not experience this effect. As a result, I generally feel this is not a good scenario, but could be considered as a fringe case. I would leave this to a historical scenario. A scenario based around closed terrain or river crossings are also viable, and do require higher attacker odds to be possible. At 2 to 1 odds against an enemy in a prepared defence, an attacker's rate of advance is basically halved. If the attacker has a 4 to 1 odds benefit, the advance is the same as a 2 to 1 in medium terrain, according to the US manual. While of some interest, these are better suited to historical scenarios, so I will not deal with them here. Thus, in this chart, on the left is my standard scenario framework, which I've described in detail in other videos or at the beginning of this, and on the right is a viable option, which is a lower attack odds. The attacker force mix is identical in most scenario frameworks, but the defender force mix will be 33% greater in the new scenario framework on the right. While creating the scenarios, this requires a second defender force mix, adding only 1 page per scenario situation. I suppose this is a viable option, and you could use something along these lines to give your basic scenario framework a bit more legs, that is, give a player a few more options with changed odds. There is of course another option, which I briefly discussed in other videos. In this scenario, the attacker has a 2 to 1 advantage for the first quarter of a game period of no more than 4 hours, after which the defenders gets reinforcements, which brings the defenders up to equality with the attacker. In this scenario, the attacker has a very short time period to break through. If successful, the game ends. If not, the defender's reinforcements arrive and then tries to stabilise the front line and possibly push the attacker back at some points. This would allow play along the short axis and would have a reasonable level of interest, or at least allow you to extend your basic standard scenario. The only issue with this is the second half of the game would settle down to 2 sides looking at each other doing nothing. So this may be, possibly excluded, or at least you finish the game early. This leaves us with a very short game. In LWRS turns, this would occur in the first day or be 6 game turns long. For Spearhead, such a scenario would be a sweet spot, lasting no more than 24 game turns, and with sufficient fine tuning, you could probably tune it down to 12 game turns. In conclusion, in order to get any form of movement, a player has to achieve a specific superiority at a specific point in the playing area. A 2-to-1 odds will get an advance. When playing at odds of 1.5 to 1, this is not possible across the entire front line, but is possible in a single 30 to 6 centimetre wide sector of the front line. Thus, at odds of 1.5 to 1 or less, you need width in your playing area. 3-to-1 odds gets you very rapid advances and should only be possible in a narrow sector of the front line. However, after this reasonably long video, and in the end, I have 2 basic scenarios which can be played out in 3 to 6 games each, and I'm left where I begin. Creating a standard scenario, only alternating the nationality, does not obtain or give a player with reasonable, repeatable ad hoc scenario generation capabilities. This idea works in ancients because the truth types differ so much, and you have the additional complexity of the rock, paper, scissors combination. This does not really exist in other periods, or at least not to the same extent, and the comparison is readily understood when you compare troop types. Infantry caught in the open by tanks are stuffed, for example, and you quickly learn this, so you don't really get a rock, paper, scissors combination or effect because you don't even get yourself into that particular position. And so we conclude my episode 58 of my video series, in this case looking at fixed ad hoc scenarios, which unfortunately come to the conclusion that if you create a fixed ad hoc scenario using points around it, you're only going to get a fairly slow number of games before you basically play the scenario out. So this may not be a good long-term solution, but certainly could provide you with a good short-term solution. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.